Welcome to Med Together. This is a podcast by the people, for the people, as it were. My name is Chana. I'm a med student in New York. This podcast deals with a lot of med school topics, starting from the basic sciences and building its way up, and hopefully it'll be a bit of review that can help y'all consolidate and synthesize important information and maybe phrase it in a way that's easy to understand. By the way, if you're pre-med or you're a nursing student, or you're just interested in sciencey, medically topics, and you're not in healthcare at all, you're totally welcome to. We don't discriminate. If you're interested, you're cool. Ready to rock? Let's do this. Hey everyone, welcome if you're new, welcome back if you're a repeat listener. Today's talk is in the cell biology series and we're going to discuss generation of action potential today. If you didn't check out last episode for a refresher on membrane potential, I suggest giving that a really quick listen because we're going to dive straight in. So just to remind ourselves, the potential is representing the charge of the inside of a cell with respect to the outside, and it's established by the weighted average of the equilibrium potentials of all the involved ions. A change in membrane potential is going to require a change in ion conductance, i.e. the permeability of a cell to a given ion. Keep in mind that if the membrane potential is equal to the equilibrium potential for a given ion, there's going to be no conductance. The current is only generated when there's a difference between the membrane potential and the equilibrium potential for that ion. Now, we're not generally going to have that problem because we don't have just a single ion in isolation, but in theory, at the point when you reach the equilibrium potential, there is no conductance. Okay, one thing to keep in mind with action potentials is that action potentials are binary. You have to hit a threshold in order for an action potential to be propagated, and if you don't hit that threshold, nothing happens. You didn't depolarize the cell enough. The reason that these have a threshold is because all of the channels and the gates that we're going to talk about are voltage-gated ion channels. And in order for a voltage-gated ion channel to open, you have to hit a certain voltage. One more thing. By convention, cations flowing out of a cell is called a positive current, and cations flowing into a cell is called a negative current. This is actually fairly arbitrary, but if you want a way to remember it, think of the cell as a reference point. So if you have positive charge flowing away from the reference point, that's a positive current, and if you have positive charge flowing towards the reference point, that's a negative current. Now, I only bring this up because sometimes it confuses people when they think about the graphical representation of the action potential because it seems to be opposite to that. Let me explain what I mean by that and why it shouldn't confuse you. So when you're looking at the graph of that action potential, and I can't show it to you here because this is an audio-only show, this is one of the moments where I wish I had a visual aid, but this is deliberately audio-only so you can listen to it while you're doing other things. So just kind of try to picture in your mind the action potential curve. I'm sure most of you know what it looks like. So on that picture of the action potential, the upward deflection represents an inflow of positive ions, and a downward deflection represents an outflow of positive ions. Even though this is opposite to the currents, we're not really talking about the currents here. We have to think about the picture of the action potential as a graph of the membrane potential with, upward being positive, downward being negative, as it would be on a regular XY kind of graph. So more positive ions flowing into the cell makes the membrane potential more positive because you're essentially closing the gap between the more negative intracellular space and the more negative extracellular space. The membrane potential is always going to change according to the change that's happening to the intracellular space because they're always talking about the inside with respect to the outside. So if you have positive ions flowing in, the membrane potential is becoming more positive. And that's why the action potential graph looks like it does. If this never confused you and I just confused you more, ignore what I said. But if you were confused by the current and the membrane potential and all of that being opposite, just think about it as an inflow of positive ions makes the membrane potential more positive, which is why we're having an upward deflection, because we're just looking at the membrane potential. We're not thinking about whether the current is positive or negative. Okay, with those preliminaries out of the way, let's talk about action potential generation. The premise of electrochemical signaling is that cells are able to change and manipulate their membrane permeability, which allows them to manipulate the conductance of different ions and therefore the membrane potential. So all of this happens with ion channels. What are ion channels? We talked about them. These are proteins that allow a specific ion to pass through, and they're made specific by the size of the pore and the charge density. So most channels are going to be gated either by voltage or by ligands, and they open fairly quickly. Other channels are not gated at all, and these are the simplest ones. Are just basically like holes in the membrane that allow something specific through, but all the channels that we're going to discuss today are voltage-gated channels. Now, another thing to just discuss is that we're talking about changing conductance to an ion. And what do we mean when we say the conductance of an ion? So the conductance is the measure of how many ions can pass through the membrane per second. Overall conductance of the membrane is going to be determined by the number of channels times the conductance of each channel. When we discuss an increase in conductance in relation to the action potential, what we mean to say is that more channels are opened, but the conductance of each individual channel remains fixed. So we're opening more channels and, in effect, adding more channels, so we increase the conductance, but we're not making any channel more or less conductive. Now, a major difference between the sodium and the potassium channels, because those are really the big ions we're going to be talking about in generating membrane potential, is that potassium has just a single gate, which is voltage gated, and sodium channels actually have two gates in series, what we call an activation gate and what we call an inactivation gate. And both of these channels are voltage gated, but in opposite ways. And you'll see, we're going to talk about them in very great detail. The advantage of having a voltage-gated channel is, first of all, that voltage is a very sensitive gating mechanism. It doesn't take a lot of ion flow to change the membrane potential enough, making this fairly metabolically efficient. You don't need this huge jump in voltage. And it's also efficient in that it means you don't need an auxiliary protein that's activated by a change in potential to then control the channel, because the more steps you have and the more complicated it is, the easier it is for something to go wrong. So it's just much more straightforward and much cleaner that the voltage controls it directly. And finally, it also allows for feedback regulation, because if the gates are controlled by potential, as they open, they're going to contribute to the potential, which allows for positive and negative feedback loops, depending on which way it's voltage gated, whether it's opened by a more positive membrane potential or whether it's opened by a more negative membrane potential. And again, when we discuss the action potential, which we're almost there, and we're going to go through it in a lot of detail, and you'll see how some gates are gated one way and some are gated the other way, and how you can have both positive and negative feedback loops controlled by the flow of ions that are generating the action potential. So the activation and inactivation gates of the sodium channels. At rest, the activation gates are going to be mostly closed, but as you depolarize the membrane, they open. So these activation gates are opened by an increase in membrane potential. Now the sodium inactivation gates are going to be mostly open at resting potential, but they close with depolarization. So these are also voltage gated, but they are voltage gated the other way, in that they are opened by a more negative membrane potential and they're closed by a more positive membrane potential. The trick is that both gates have to be open in order for sodium to flow through. So there's a very narrow window where the activation gates start opening and the inactivation gates haven't closed yet, because the activation gates react just a little bit faster than the inactivation gates. And that's the only time when you're getting an increase in sodium flow, and that's when you're starting to see that increase in potential. So, as promised, we're going to go through all the phases of the action potential and explain what's happening with the gates, and you'll see how this really actually super cool mechanism works. Okay, so at resting potential, which is about minus 60-ish for most cells, minus 70, you have the potassium gates are closed, sodium activation gates are closed, sodium inactivation gates, about 2/3 of them are open. They're not going to be all open at this point. Now you have the upstroke, which comes when there's some kind of external depolarization that depolarizes the gates to threshold. What do we mean by threshold? Threshold means enough depolarization to open the sodium activation gates. So the activation gates flip open and sodium starts rushing in, because remember, the inactivation gates were already open. And this further depolarizes the membrane, which opens even more sodium activation gates. This is a positive feedback loop. Now, the potassium channels are still closed because they haven't responded yet, and the sodium inactivation gates are still mostly open because they haven't responded yet either. Now, when you reach the peak of the action potential, at this point, all the activation gates are open. The sodium gates we already said were open, and now the potassium gates get the message and they open. But the sodium inactivation gates have also gotten the message, so it's starting to close. And so the sodium conductance starts decreasing. It's not completely gone. It's not like an on-off sort of thing where like they close all at once, but they're starting to close. So you're starting to get a little bit less sodium conductance. And also another thing that's contributing to the repolarization is the potassium gates, because you have to note that potassium efflux is a negative feedback loop, because potassium going out, which is the way that potassium flows when its gates are open, is repolarizing the membrane, and it's actually closing its own gates because its gates are voltage gated and they open with depolarization. So this is an example of a negative feedback loop in a voltage gated channel. So now during the downstroke, the sodium activation gates are starting to close because remember, they're voltage gated and they get closed by repolarization. And the potassium gates are actually still opening because they're still responding to the depolarization. They're a little bit slower on the uptake, so they're actually still opening. And that's why we reach this phase, which we call the undershoot, because more potassium was let out than maybe the cell, quote unquote, wanted to, because the potassium gates respond fairly slowly. So at this point, we're actually below resting potential, and the neuron is said to be in its absolute refractory period. And then the membrane potential starts to recover. the sodium inactivation gates are opening because of the repolarization, and the sodium activation gates are not completely all closed. They're mostly closed, but you're getting a little bit of sodium conductance, and there's a little bit of potassium, but you're getting a little bit of sodium conductance through those activation gates that are still open, and the neuron is slowly making its way back to resting potential. This is called the relative refractory period, where in theory the neuron actually could be depolarized now, but you would need a bigger stimulus because you're starting from lower down. You have to get it to threshold. Now, can the threshold be changed? The answer to that is yes. So you can actually raise the threshold by changing the rate of the depolarization. If the depolarization comes more slowly, the potassium gates are going to start opening at the same time as the sodium gates, because the sodium gates are going to open more slowly because the depolarization is happening more slowly. So there's going to be negative feedback there. Like we said, you'll need a larger depolarization to combat that. So if you have a slow depolarization, the threshold is higher. And actually, if you start from a hyperpolarized state, even though you have farther to go to get to threshold, the inactivation gates are more open than they are at resting potential. Remember, because the inactivation gates are opened by repolarization. So your threshold may actually be lower, because when the activation gates start getting opened, there are more inactivation gates that are still open, and you're going to get more sodium conductance. So interestingly, if you depolarize from a hyperpolarized state, even though you have further to go to hit threshold, the threshold itself may actually be a little lower. And another thing to keep in mind is that hypocalcemia can trick the membrane channels into thinking that the membrane is more depolarized than it is, and they may fire without any impulse. This is called hypocalcemia tetany. So how many ions actually have to move to generate an action potential? Because if you think about it, we're talking about all this like flowing of ions across the membrane. You're thinking, wouldn't this upset all the charges inside and outside, and isn't the cell going to be all disoriented? And the answer is actually no. So sorry to bring you back to physics, but if we use the equation for charge, which says that charge is equal to capacitance times the voltage, I'm not going to make you do the math, but if you do the calculation, you'll find that actually about a picomole, which is a very small amount of sodium, per square centimeter of membrane needs to move. And this is very, very little compared to the amount of sodium in the cell and in the extracellular fluid. The intracellular sodium increases by about 0.0008% per action potential. So the change in ion concentration per action potential is so small as to be insignificant. Eventually, the sodium pump will kick in after like 100 action potentials to start pumping sodium out, but it's not directly coupled to the action potential because there's not enough sodium brought in any given action potential to trigger the pumps to turn on. And just to talk about the sodium and potassium channels a little bit, so the selectivity filters of the sodium potassium channels are a little bit different. The sodium channel is a little bit more generous. It's a little bit bigger. It allows the sodium through with 1 or 2 waters of hydration. And the sodium channels, even though there are different sodium channels in different cells, they're fairly similar. Potassium channels are a little bit more complicated. They have a backbone that has carbonyl oxygens, which actually kind of bind the potassium, and the potassium gets bound by one, then bound by another, and it gets kind of like pulled through the channel. It's a little bit more complicated. And the potassium channels are a lot more specialized than the sodium channels. They're actually a lot more different kinds. So sodium channels, like I said, are pretty similar. There are 4 repeats of a single chain. Essentially, it's a tetramer, all the same chain, not too different. Potassium channels are heterotetramers, so they have 4 different subunits that all have to come together. So this allows for some kind of mixing and matching in the way that they assemble. Just, side note about the channels, which I thought was interesting. And now another thing to note is that these channels are actually really what drive the action potential. And you might say, yeah, Hannah, we just talked about that. No, what I'm telling you is it is only about the channels. They actually did this very interesting experiment where they took an axon and took out the axoplasm, which is the equivalent of the cytoplasm, and they found that if they reperfused it with a solution that had the same tonicity, they weren't changing the tonicity at all, they just got rid of all the proteins and everything inside the cytoplasm of the axon, they found that action potentials can be generated and propagated anyway. It's really all about the membrane and the channels in the membrane, which is very cool. So just to talk about action potential propagation for a second, the energy of the action potential has to be large enough that it depolarizes an adjacent area to threshold, and then that turns on the voltage-gated sodium channels of the next area. You get another action potential, and that's how it propagates down the length of the axon. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with the concept that different axons have different speeds of conduction. So how exactly do we change the speed of conductance? Conduction velocity is going to be a constant for a given axon under most conditions. And there are two rate-limiting steps that determine how fast an action potential can propagate down a given axon. It's actually not the time for the current to flow down the axon. The current flowing itself is pretty fast. The two things that do make a difference, though, is the time needed for the activation and inactivation gates to take up their positions and do their thing, which is also not really something that can be adjusted and not something we think about so much. The second thing, which is more significant because this is how axons regulate their speed, is the time needed to charge the adjacent areas of membrane to threshold. So to change the charge on the membrane by 10 to 15 millivolts, which is the amount you need to reach threshold, you need a fixed number of charges. And this charge is a product of current flowing down the axon and time. So the fixed number of charges can be provided in a shorter amount of time by a larger current or in a longer amount of time by a smaller current. So the more current that flows down the axon, the faster threshold is going to be reached as the action potential propagates, and the faster the conduction velocity will be. So how do we change the magnitude of the current? One factor that determines the magnitude of the current is the internal resistance of the axon itself. So the internal resistance depends on the cross-sectional area, and therefore the diameter of the axon. So this is one fairly important thing to kind of remember, is that the larger the axon, the faster the conductance is going to be because there's going to be less internal resistance, and you can get a larger current. But there is a limit to this, because the increase in diameter doesn't decrease the resistance by all that much, and we would need humongous axons to conduct at the speed that we conduct in our axons if we didn't have another solution. And here is the other solution, which is super elegant, and it's something that electrical companies have used too: insulation. We insulate our axons by myelinating them. So this is something that evolved in vertebrates. An insulating sheath around the nerve increases the proportion of current flowing down the axon instead of leaking out. It basically just holds all the charge inside and therefore decreases the resistance. So of course this insulation, this myelination, has to be broken at intervals in order to allow sodium in to regenerate the action potential, because remember, that's the whole point of the current flowing, is to be able to depolarize an adjacent area of membrane. And now any area of membrane that's insulated can't get sodium through. So we do have to have these little open areas. These are the so-called nodes of Ranvier that are in all myelinated axons. This is the only places where action potential has to be generated, because the myelin insulates the nerve enough that the current can reach from one node to the next node. We call this conduction down a myelinated nerve saltatory conduction, because the action potential seems to jump between the nodes. Just a note on the relationship between diameter and conduction speed. This is a rule of thumb. For a myelinated axon, the diameter times 6 is going to give you the conduction velocity in meters per second. So even though we said that the increase in diameter doesn't do a ton for conduction velocity, it definitely does contribute. So larger axons are still going to have greater conduction velocity. Okay, that's all I have for you today. We talked about generation of action potentials via depolarization, which occurs when voltage-gated sodium channels allow sodium in an increased membrane potential. We talked about the different gates of sodium. We talked about the potassium gate, and we talked about how they work together to allow action potentials to be possible. We talked about increasing conduction velocity by myelination, and how increase of axon diameter can also contribute to increased conduction velocity. Next time, we will tackle synaptic transmission. We'll talk first about the neuromuscular junction, and then we'll talk about some CNS synaptic transmission. I hope you enjoyed and you learned something today, and I'll catch y'all next time.